The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leslie McGee with the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center. Welcome to today's presentation, Mental Health in Older Adults, What APS Needs to Know. Today's webinar is being presented by Katie Wilson from the National Adult Protective Services Training Center. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I want to address a few housekeeping items. NAMERS and the APS TARC is a project of the U.S. Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging, Department of Health and Human Services, and administered by WRMA Incorporated. Contractors' findings, conclusions, and points of view do not necessarily represent the official policy of the U.S. Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging, Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. This webinar is being hosted by the APS TARC. We work with states to enhance the effectiveness of APS program by supporting our partners' use of data and analytics, applying research and evaluation to practice, encouraging the use of innovative practices and strategies, and providing APS programs with individualized technical assistance. We're here to help APS programs in any way that we can. Just reach out to us using the contact information that will be displayed at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Please use your computer speakers to access audio for this webinar and make sure the speaker volume is adjusted to your desired level. If you experience audio problems due to internet connection speeds or hardware issues, we recommend exiting the webinar and re-entering. Everyone is muted for this webinar. You may ask questions of our presenter at any time by typing them into the questions box. We will relay as many as we can to the speaker when we pause for questions. Next slide, please. All attendees will receive an automatically generated email approximately 24 hours after the webinar ends with a link to a certificate of attendance. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive an email when the recording is made available on the APS TARC YouTube channel. A copy of the slide presentation is available in the handouts section of your control panel and may be downloaded at any time during this presentation. Next slide, please. Now I am going to run a quick poll, and please select the profession that most closely identifies you. Oh, I forgot to select the poll. Sorry about that. And we will leave it open for a couple of moments to give everybody an opportunity to respond. Okay, we're about halfway there with the audience voting. We're going to give you a couple more seconds. Okay, a couple of people are still voting, so we will give people a few more minutes because we were a little behind getting started. Okay, so our response, not very surprising. Most of the people here are APS professionals. We do have some other social services representatives, people from the legal profession, and people who identified as other. Thank you very much for that response. Next slide, please. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Katie, and allow her to introduce herself. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Leslie. Hi, my name is Katie Wilson, and I've been training for APS for over 10 years now. Hard to believe. But right now I work with the National APS Training Center, and I'm the lead instructional designer. But before that, I worked for the state of Texas in the APS training team. And then before that, I worked as an APS worker for a number of years. And that's where I just absolutely fell in love with APS. But I do have a background in mental health. I have my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. So it's always so exciting whenever I get to combine these two worlds of APS and mental health. So You may know this already, but I'm going to mention it, that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So this just comes at like the perfect time, right? And because the whole point of Mental Health Awareness Month is to bring about awareness for the importance of mental health for yourself and for the people we work with. So, so next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I started as an APS worker, and one thing I quickly realized was that APS has an interesting role when it comes to mental health. We're not counselors, we're not doctors, we're not diagnosing people, we're not providing mental health treatment, at least I wasn't at that time, but yet we work with people with mental health conditions on most days, and sometimes like a lot more often than we realize. So when we knock on that door, we don't know what to expect. If you don't have a background in mental health, or if you have limited knowledge on mental health, then working with someone that has a mental health diagnosis can really be daunting. You may not know what to expect. Your experience may be limited, so you only really have TV shows and movies as guidance on what to expect with mental health. And we know One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is not an accurate portrayal of mental health, so not really a good place to reference. I recall back when I was an undergrad, I was getting my degree in psychology, and we had to do volunteer work. And so I volunteered at the San Antonio AIDS Foundation. And I found out one of the individuals I was working with had diagnosis of schizophrenia. So when I found out about that, you know, I was 18 years old, so naive to the world, and I was like, oh my goodness, he's gonna attack me. If I'm by myself, he's gonna attack me. Like, these are the thoughts that were going through my head, because I'm imagining, you know, the TV shows, like every horror movie you watch, you know, the killer always ends up having a mental health issue, and you know, schizophrenia tends to be the one that gets picked on a lot. And so I'm imagining all of this, and you know, I come to, you know, talk with him, and I was like, he's like a normal person. And it's like, of course, Katie, yes. Just because someone has a mental health diagnosis does not mean they're violent. It does not mean they're going to attack you. And it does not mean they're not normal, whatever normal may be. So this just goes to show how much I have learned over the years. And so, and at that time, I only had movies to go off of. So fortunately, I was able to go through school and just, you know, working with individuals, it really shifts your perspective. And so, so next slide. So the reason why I brought you here today. No, so learning objectives, we're going to, I'm an instructional designer, so this is what we do. Now, what I'm hoping to accomplish with you all today is we're going to talk about the common symptoms and behaviors of the 4 most common mental health disorders in older adults. So the focus of this webinar is going to be on older adults, but it's not to say that a lot of what we talk about won't also work with adults with disabilities, because I know that APSs across the US work with varying populations, so some focus on just older adults, some with people with disabilities, but I will be addressing a lot of the specifics of how mental health will appear for a lot of older adults. We're going to talk about how symptoms and behaviors of mental health conditions can impact APS casework. So bottom line, I want this to be relevant for you. As an APS worker, a lot of times it will get frustrating to, you know, learn about mental health, but not really see, like, how does this apply to what I need to do? Because I'm not providing treatment, I'm not doing the counseling with them. You know, as an APS worker, what do I need to know? And so this is what our intent is for today. And so we're going to talk about ways to adapt your communication, ways you can adapt your case planning to better accommodate somebody that's experiencing symptoms of a mental health condition. So before we get full on into the training, I do like to give a warning that when we talk about mental health, it may bring up emotional feelings. You know, we all may have had a background, you know, whether it's somebody we know, maybe for us personally, some experience that might bring up some things. So please take care of yourself as we're going through the training. You know, if you need to mentally check out, that's okay, you know, and you do what you need to do to take care of you, because that's the number one important thing here. So. And we will briefly touch on suicide later today or later in the webinar, and I will warn you of that. So if you can mentally prepare for that. So let's go to the next slide. So I like to explain the terminology going into this just because different organizations will use certain terminology and interchange it. So you'll hear mental health conditions, mental illness, mental disorders. So just to show some intentionality with how I'm using my language today, mental health condition is a more general term. So it's describing the conditions that are affecting person's thinking, feeling, behavior, and it's these conditions that are impacting the day-to-day living. And relationships as well. And then when I refer to a mental disorder, I'm speaking to a term used specifically for a specific diagnosis that's used in the DSM-5. So, you know, that big chunky book that many of us were required to get that was very expensive in college. So, but for those that are not as familiar with that, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And this is what we use to find the symptoms and criteria for someone to meet the definition for certain diagnosis, what people use to diagnose individuals. So, I will bring up that I personally do not like to use the word mental illness because of the stigma that has attached itself to mental ill. It just has a certain connotation to it. And I know a lot of other organizations are moving away from it as well. If you still use the term, that's okay. You know, it's a process with language and changing. But I will say one thing I am very intentional about is using person first language, because putting the person before the diagnosis, you know, I was an APS worker. I know we have those cases like, all right, I'm going to go see Miss Jones, the schizophrenic today. It hurts me to say those words out loud now because I'm like, it's not person first. But it's a learning process, you know, if instead to say I'm going to go visit my client that has schizophrenia, if that's relevant to the situation, but they're a person first before their diagnosis. So, and I encourage you to do the same. I'm sure many of you are moving in that direction or are already there, but this will help move towards the destigmatization of mental health. So next slide. So with mental health, there's a lot of myths about it. As I mentioned, when I was young undergrad, I was like, ooh, those people with mental health conditions, they're so violent, they're ready to attack me. And that's not what's happening. That's a myth, and that's been perpetuated by media. Because, you know, media's got to sensationalize things, and, you know, mental health is commonly misunderstood because a lot of people don't have an opportunity to really explore what it is. So the fact of that is that people with mental health conditions is less than 7% of violent acts are committed by persons with symptoms of mental health conditions. Media spins a different story because what actually is going on, and we probably see this a lot as APS workers, is that people with severe mental health conditions are actually 10 times more likely to be the victims of a violent crime than that of the general population. So our paths may cross more frequently for a number of reasons, but that may be one of why APS interacts with people with mental health conditions, because a lot of times those conditions will put them in vulnerable situations. There's also the stigma that mental health conditions are having a mental health condition as a sign of weakness. So this will make many not want to seek out counseling. Many won't even talk about it. And so normalizing mental health conditions is one step to showing like, hey, getting help is actually a strength. Like acknowledging that you need that additional support is actually a strength. And then third, depression and anxiety are a normal part of aging. That is a myth. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit later as we get into the depression and anxiety sections. But I want to encourage you to think, when we're thinking of these myths, and I mean, I hear these from just, you know, general people I talk to, you know, talking about how, you know, mental health is just like, oh, everyone's making a big deal. Everyone has a mental health diagnosis these days. You know, everyone can't handle their stress. You know, a lot of these very harmful statements that I hear from people, it's something that's common. And so one of the things that, you know, I aim to do through my work with, you know, training APS or just with working in mental health in general is to work towards destigmatizing mental health. So, so let's go to the next slide. So older adults and mental health. So it's estimated that at least 1 in 4 older adults is living with a mental health condition. So many older adults are at risk for mental health problems, but this does not mean that mental health is a normal part of aging. So a lot of studies actually show that most older adults are pretty satisfied with their life, and that's despite any diagnosis, medical diagnosis they may have, or like physical limitations. Like they're pretty chill, they're pretty resilient, is what a lot of the studies will say. But sometimes, as you get older, important life changes will happen, and so things that will cause an excessive amount of stress. So death of a loved one, retirement, getting diagnosed with those serious diagnoses, those medical diagnoses. And sometimes, most of the time they will adjust and adapt. Older adults are very resilient, but because there are more incidents that may happen as they continue to get older, there will be times that it may be more challenging. And so then those types of situations may put them at a greater risk of experiencing mental health symptoms. So things like depression and anxiety in particular. Older adults tend to underutilize mental health services. And a lot of this is because the stigmatization, and I feel like we're in a shift now where mental health is becoming more in day-to-day conversation, that we as a society are moving in a positive direction when it comes to talking about it and framing it in a more positive light, like similar to that of like medical conditions, as opposed to like, ooh, they have depression. It's changing. But consider those that were born before 1960. The world is very different, and there's a lot of that historical shame and really ignorance that comes to understanding mental health conditions. And so this tends to be seen with our older adults when they're like not wanting to admit that they're experiencing a mental health condition. So some things to consider as you're working with older adults. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned in the learning objectives, we're going to focus on 4 mental health conditions in older adults. I know there's a big, thick book of the DSM symptoms, and I wish I had all the time to go over them, but we're going to focus on the most important, okay, I want to do that. We're going to focus on the ones we will see more often. So the ones that are either higher occurrence or the ones that are particularly debilitating when they're not treated. So generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And so I do want to note that substance use disorder is another diagnosis that's common with older adults, but that really could just be an entire webinar on its own, because there's so many layered aspects to it. Plus, a lot of individuals with the diagnosis that are listed here will also may also have a higher likeliness of developing a substance use disorder as a way to self-medicate themselves to help with symptoms. And so what to expect coming up then, I'm going to briefly discuss the symptoms for each of these, how this may appear different for older adults, and how these would impact our APS casework. And then what are some things we can expect to help align our expectations. And just so you know, by no means am I expecting you to be fully armed, ready to diagnose people, because for one, we don't diagnose an APS, at least that I'm aware of. APS does not diagnose, but the intent is for you to have a context to better understand a person's situation. But keep in mind, every person's unique. So just because someone has a diagnosis doesn't mean they're going to follow all the symptoms that are listed. Doesn't mean they're going to be a cookie cutter copy of this diagnosis. And you meet one person with depression and it's going to be very different from another that's diagnosed with depression. So consider that as we're moving forward. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're talking about generalized anxiety disorder. I want to walk you through something first. So if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, and I want you to consider and think you are walking through and having a beautiful hike out in Colorado. The air is crispy and cool. You can feel the breeze through your hair. You can hear the birds singing, and then you open your eyes and there's a mountain lion in your path. So if you're anyone probably but me, I would want to go pet the mountain lion, but I'll pretend I'm afraid. And I probably should be afraid, but you see a mountain lion. What are you feeling in that moment? If you're going through this beautiful walk, what are those feelings? Are you feeling anxious? I would say you probably should be feeling anxious. That's really what we're hardwired for. We're meant to feel this way because our anxiety is going to warn us about these possible threats to the environment, and that's what's going to motivate us to go to a safe environment or to do adaptive behaviors that are going to improve our chances of survival. So those feelings you're feeling, like you may be feeling like a deep pit in your stomach, you may be feeling cold sweat, your heart might be racing, any variety of feelings. But anxiety serves an evolutionary purpose, so this is why we're feeling this way. But what happens when you're feeling like you're seeing mountain lions all the time? Like you are constantly feeling that feeling of dread through anything. That's a generalized anxiety disorder in a simplistic way. There's a lot of catastrophic thinking that happens where we're magnifying, something that could be a threat into, no, this is going to happen. I have a follow-up appointment with the doctor. He's going to tell me I'm going to die, and this is the feeling that I'm feeling. So that's just to distinguish. Anxiety is there for a reason, but when it is just excessive, we can't control it, that's when it gets into the generalized anxiety disorder. And then we can get into specifics. It could be linked to a specific phobia. So I'm sure many of you have heard of arachnophobia, intense fear of spiders, and it goes beyond just I don't like spiders. It goes into I don't want to leave the house because I might see a spider by accident, or I saw a spider outside my door once and I'm not doing that again. Then you go to social anxiety disorder, and this is where you have excessive fears about social situations. So imagine telling a person with social anxiety they need to go physically to a doctor's office. You might as well be sending them to their death. That's how they are feeling. So considering what you are asking of a person when they're feeling these symptoms. And then agoraphobia, that kind of is in a sense like just leaving the house is going to be a tall ask for somebody. I know I was watching a show recently that portrayed this pretty well, where she was like bracing herself and holding the door handle, and like they were showing her racing thoughts, and she backed away and was like, no, I can't do it. And she didn't go to her sister's wedding because she was too afraid to leave the house. And we have panic disorder, which can happen. It happens when there's recurrent panic attacks. So these are like those abrupt surges of fear. They usually peak for a few minutes, and then there's a host of physical and cognitive symptoms. So, that sweat, that squeezing heart feeling, and just that feeling of, oh my goodness, what is happening to my body? And it tends to be unexpected, but there are sometimes that there's certain cues will set it off. And so let's go to the next slide. So this is a list of the symptoms, and these are the ones we've kind of been talking about already. But these are some, I think, the ones that could fit on the slide anyways. These come directly from the DSM. And so, but one thing I do want to really emphasize is that everyone will experience anxiety in a multitude of ways, and it will be different from somebody else's. And so I'm gonna probably keep saying this over and over, but I say it because it's important that this is what the experience is, but it's gonna feel a little different for different people. And for older adults, you see predominantly physical symptoms being expressed. So somebody feeling more of that like racing heart, that sweat, that redness. And oftentimes this gets misattributed to be a medical condition, because there's a lot of medical conditions that fit this symptom profile. And then on the flip side, there are many symptoms of medical conditions that can mimic anxiety. And so they get disentangled, these symptoms. So many older adults don't receive a diagnosis for anxiety because they're getting treated for their symptoms, which are believed to be a medical condition. So then a lot of times the root cause of where those symptoms are coming from isn't being addressed. So, so I do want to remark that with anxiety, it's a very common diagnosis, common with older adults as well. But while it may be relatable, what makes it different is that what makes this diagnosis different is that it's affecting their day-to-day living. And so if we're working with someone that is terrified to go to a doctor because they have an intense phobia of the doctor's office, us trying to talk them through it it really isn't our role, but we need to align our service planning with our expectations. We can't get frustrated if they don't go, because this may be because they're experiencing these intense fear symptoms. So I'm going to transition now to talk about major depressive disorder. Because again, like anxiety, this is a very common condition. So I'm sorry, next slide. So this goes beyond just feeling a little down, feeling a little sad. This is where there's that depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. And so it's the number one cause of depression is one of the most encountered mental health conditions in the world. And so it's one of the most prevalent, in particular for older adults. So much so that so many are saying, you know, oh, that's just a natural part of aging. But it is not. Like, there may be a higher likeliness of it because of what we discussed earlier, but it's not something to be expected. And keep in mind that there's early onset and late onset depression. So early onset's where they're diagnosed with depression early on. And for a lot of older adults, this may have been integrated into their identity on some level, especially if they haven't sought out treatment, and especially if they're not even aware they have depression. And so confronting that later may get some concerns about, like, no, that's just who I am. I'm grumpy. That's how I am with life. I've always been this way. Then we have late onset, and late onset may happen later in life for older adults. And a lot of times this is associated with risk factors such as, you know, becoming a widow, physical illnesses, or having an impaired functional status. So one of the things as we're going through, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So for the next slide here, I have a list of the symptoms here, but I want to, there was a notation on the previous slide that I want to return to, that I want to mention as we're looking at these symptoms. Because for older adults tend to show fewer of the, they call them the affective symptoms. So like feelings of sadness or guilt, the crying, the mood, the mood appearance, like a lot of, or feeling. For older adults, they tend to present with more of the cognitive symptoms. So you might see some memory loss. So maybe some concerns with sleep, maybe some agitation. And when you think about these symptoms, and there's something that tends to happen with older adults, they mention memory loss and everyone jumps to a neurocognitive disorder, which we also call dementia. So everyone jumps to that because they see an age, but a lot of times they don't rule out that this memory loss could be because of major depression disorder. And a lot of times, because there's not that mood state that goes with a lot of the other symptoms, many older adults may not recognize that they're experiencing depression. Because a lot of times, like, especially as they get older, like think of like an older male, like maybe 80 or older, you know, I think of like a grandpa, like crotchety, grumpy, crabby, and then like, I don't care. Like, I think I saw a commercial recently where it's like, I think he was smelling like fabric softener, and he's like, I don't care about anything, but I like this. Like, that honestly could be a major depressive disorder. But I'm not gonna diagnose a guy in a commercial, but I'm just saying, like, this is not something that we should, when you're looking at it in combination with the other symptoms, just because someone's not crying and saying they're depressed all the time doesn't necessarily rule out a depressive disorder. So then what will happen is, especially like in older adult situations, with depression, a lot of times you'll see that low energy, that lack of motivation, and so may impact a follow through with appointments. So you might sit there with a person, you're like, all right, we've got a plan. Let's work through this case plan. You're going to call your daughter to come help you clean the house. You're going to make an appointment to the doctor, and they may be in full agreement for it. But then what happens the next day is that they may have more symptoms presenting for their depressive disorder to where they can't even get out of bed. Like, the thought of even getting out of bed to pick up a phone just feels like it's demanding so much of them. And so they may not do it. So fast forward a week later, APS worker shows back up. Hey, where are you at with our plan? And they might be like, well, I didn't do it. APS worker, look, I've been there. What? Why would you not do it? What? We had a plan. What could we do different? And, you know, and I'll be honest, there are many times in my head I'm thinking like, why are you being so resistant to me? Why don't you want to work with me? We're trying to make this work. I want to encourage you to get better so we can make you feel better. Like these very, you know, naive ways of thinking. And, you know, there's some situations where someone may be perceived as being lazy. Like, oh, you just didn't feel like making a phone call because you just didn't want to. Well, consider that it may be a depressive a symptom of depression. So being aware of that, being able to adapt and being careful about blaming the person. And so just being aware of these things as you're working with them. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So Katie's broken record. She keeps saying this over and over. But if you take anything away from this webinar, it should be this statement. Anxiety and depression are common with aging, but it is not a normal part of aging if it's interfering with daily life. So I keep bringing this up because this is something that it's a stigma. You know, many of us are guilty of believing, you know, that older adults, well, you know, they're experiencing a lot of sadness because of what's going on in their life. So, but just be aware that if somebody is expressing to you that they are experiencing these symptoms, encourage them to seek out help for it, and assure them like, you should not be feeling this way. This is not a normal expectation part of getting older. And depression and anxiety are highly treatable if they're seeking out the services for it. So when you're working with somebody and they're explaining these things, you know, don't think they're not trying hard enough to get better. You know, like we might falsely assume we understand their situation because anxiety and depression are part of our emotional spectrum. You know, if I'm feeling depressed and I don't have a diagnosis of depression, I'm not experiencing those symptoms of major depression, I may inaccurately assume somebody can just snap out of it, you know, go for a run and feel better, you know, or, you know, watch a happy movie, go to a comedy show and you'll feel better in no time. Like depression requires treatment in most situations, and same thing with anxiety. So don't fault the person that they're not trying hard enough to will beyond that. And then just don't assume too, because they're having difficulty concentrating, this may be a symptom of these conditions, and it doesn't mean that they're not able to make decisions for themselves. So don't assume that they shouldn't have a voice in their service plannings, in their casework. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide because we're shifting gears a little bit to some of the more severe diagnosis. So bipolar disorder. I'm going to start by telling you a case example that I worked, because I think of this gentleman every time I consider bipolar disorder, because first off, he's just a really cool dude. Like he was a math professor. I'm going to call him Vincent just for our purposes, but he was a retired math professor, so incredibly smart. And so I really enjoyed talking with him whenever I would interview with him. Well, we were involved because Vincent would get in these episodes and he would, so I remember visiting with him once and he was like spending money on these investments. He was so excited about these investments, but he was spending all of his limited income on this investment, which then resulted in looking at how are you going to pay your electric bill now, Vincent? You know, and then there was concern because, you know, I remember one day, and it really took me by surprise, I walked into he invited me into the apartment and walked in, and there was math formulas all over the wall. And he was so excited because he felt like he solved this problem he has been working his whole life to accomplish. So this would be a great example of someone in a manic episode. So bipolar is characterized by extreme moods. So think of like a roller coaster. You got the ups and the downs. So when someone is experiencing mania, they're feeling more of the ups. And when they're going down, they're feeling more of those depressive symptoms. And so sometimes the episodes can last for several days, sometimes even longer. So let's go ahead in the next slide. So since we, Yeah, since we already talked about depression symptoms, I wanted to show you some mania symptoms here. So a lot of it is that inflated self-esteem, that talkative, the flight of ideas, that the racing thoughts, the distractibility. So just imagine I'm standing there talking to Vincent and I'm trying to come up with a case, case plan with him. And he's like, wait, hold on a second. And he'll like run off and start writing something, and very distractible. So lots of redirection, lots of patience. That is one thing when working with, with working with people in general, but I would say in particular those with mental health conditions, allowing plenty of time for those interactions, because rushing somebody through or being very forceful with your redirections tends to not work well. It tends to shut down the conversation. It damages trust, damages the rapport you're building. So don't go visit with somebody, especially for the first time and you don't know what to expect, if you are limited on your time. And I know easier said than done, but I get it. But if you're able to set aside that time, you're going to do yourself a favor and build yourself more time and opportunity to build that rapport. So back to bipolar disorder. So bipolar is less common than depression, but it tends to be more debilitating. Because this will require long-term preventative treatment. So this is something they will likely be on for their entire life. And what tends to happen then with older adults is they're more, I guess they're more susceptible to side effects, and a lot of the psychiatric medications will come with some pretty significant side effects. So a lot of times, and I know for me as a worker, a lot of times we would get involved because somebody wasn't adhering to their medication regimen because they didn't like the side effects. And then it started to create the symptoms again. And then they would get into these cycles. And then another thing too, is a lot of times when they would enter the mania phase, it felt good, like having that burst of energy and that focus, that motivation, and a lot of times they're like, all right, medications are working, and they'll stop taking them and thinking I'm cured, and that then we'll start the cycle again. And so some things to consider. And again, similar to what we've talked about with anxiety and depression, there's oftentimes some confusion for cognitive impairment with symptoms of bipolar, because you'll see that agitation, that impulsivity, poor decision making, and that could start to sound like a neurocognitive disorder. And especially if we're working with an older adult, it's like that's where a lot of those minds jump. It's like, oh, they're experiencing a neurocognitive disorder. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're shifting a bit to talk about schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, and we'll talk more in a moment on the next slide what that means exactly. But this is one of the more debilitating, if left untreated, mental health conditions. Just so we know, for the record, this is not split personality disorder. I'm amazed that this is still coming up after all this time. But my goodness, I'm pretty sure I saw a horror movie recently where they had split personality disorder, but they were diagnosed as schizophrenia, and it's just cringy to watch. So just for the record, it is not the same. That's a different diagnosis, and it's very rare. So schizophrenia is also pretty rare, but the reason why I include it is because it's so significant, especially if someone's not receiving treatment or they stop receiving treatment, because they can oftentimes really get into dangerous situations. Again, echoing earlier statements, schizophrenia does not cause somebody to become violent. This is a myth. So much like when I think about my bipolar story, when I think about schizophrenia, I think about this individual that I worked with. I call her, for the sake of today, I'm calling her Josephine. So I was investigating a case on financial exploitation. There was concerns that her daughter was taking advantage of her financial situation. I didn't know anything about Josephine except for the concern, because it was called in by the bank. They didn't know much about Josephine, but they were like, clearly she's an older adult, go visit her, check out what's going on. So I go to the house and she invites me in, and she immediately is like, I'm having a really rough day today. I'm like, okay, what's going on? And she's like, I cannot get Garth Brooks to stop bothering me. And, I'm like, okay, I was not expecting this because no one said anything about a diagnosis. I was like, okay. And I'm reflecting, you know, I'm thinking as me in my head, I'm not saying this out loud. I was like, I don't think Garth Brooks is coming over. Like, she was strongly believed that Garth Brooks was in love with her, that he was breaking into her home and writing love notes on like wooden, on her wood, like writing it with like I don't know, like a knife or something like. But she would point at like knots in the wood. She's like, see, it's in there. You have to look really hard, but it's there. He left it. It wasn't there when I left, and it was there when I came back. That's from Garth Brooks. And I'm like, okay. So I bring up this story because this illustrates a lot of important points when we're working with somebody with schizophrenia, somebody that's experiencing psychosis, and how to manage these conversations. But I'm going to pause because I want to go to the next slide so we can get on the same page as far as what these symptoms of schizophrenia are. So delusions and hallucinations are the trademark symptoms of schizophrenia. So delusions is a fixed belief that does not have a basis in reality, and they can take on different types. So for Josephine, she was experiencing erotomanic delusions. This is where she falsely believes that, or erotomanic delusions is when person falsely believes that another person, typically it's a celebrity, typically it's a, you know, political figure, someone that's well known, is in love with them. Like, this is a common delusion that happens. There's also persecutory delusions. Many APS workers are going to be familiar with this because they tend to result in a lot of 911 calls, because these mean that someone experiencing this delusion believes someone's coming after them or trying to kill them. I've met a number of individuals that believe people are living in their attic and they're coming down and, you know, messing up things, or they're threatening them, so they're afraid to sleep at night. Then we have grandiose delusions, where a person may believe they have exceptional abilities and exceptional fame. Like I remember an individual who described herself as a CIA agent, and that she would get called to operate on occasion. Now, this person was limited with her mobility. She had difficulty getting out of the wheelchair herself. So I don't think she was a CIA agent, but you know, but one of the points is with this delusions, they believe this. This is their reality. Hallucinations are the sensory perceptions that no one else is experiencing. So these are the, hearing voices, hearing sounds that are not there, seeing things, seeing the shadow people. It could be tactile, so feeling like bugs are crawling on your skin all the time. It could be olfactory, so smells, the gustatory, the tastes. So it could take if it's your senses and it's not there, it's not actually happening, these are a form of hallucinations. Because I notice a lot of people imagine hallucinations as being strictly visual, but it's all of the senses. So then we also have disorganized speech. So a lot of times you're trying to interview, and this person, you may have a difficult time communicating with them because there's a lot of words just happening, but they don't really, they call it like word salad. It's just, it doesn't really string out to mean anything, but they're communicating. It could be disorganized behaviors. It could be catatonic behaviors. So it doesn't always, there's other aspects of schizophrenia. So a lot of times you'll see negative symptoms. So somebody that doesn't have an interest in engaging, someone that doesn't have that goal-directed behavior. So negative symptoms means that something is missing, something is removed, something is lacking. So like apathy, not caring. It could be that diminished emotional expression. So like that flat affect, no emotion. So it could look differently. Again, every person will present a little differently because people are unique, and that's what happens. So to talk a little bit on what schizophrenia for older adults. So this is something that I just recently learned not too long ago, but schizophrenia, I know, I've always heard, it's typically diagnosed when someone is younger, usually in their teens, early 20s. But there is a thing, it's late onset schizophrenia. And this will happen usually mid 40s to 60s, where someone will just seemingly out of the blue, just suddenly develop symptoms of schizophrenia. And they're usually very significant, and many will describe it as completely derailing their life. I personally haven't worked with someone that had that late onset, so I can't speak to what that looks like, you know, working in a case situation. But imagine someone's life being totally uprooted with these very severe symptoms that come out of nowhere. I know some researchers suggest that there's a lot of some researchers will suggest like that there's something that might have like activated it in their life, but they're still sorting that out. So this seems like they're still working on a lot of the research on. There's not a lot of research on older schizophrenia in older adults, but I do want to shift it a bit to talk about how significant this is on our APS work, because when you're working with somebody, you're working with a person that's having difficulty distinguishing reality from their symptoms, this can be difficult to work with. You know, there could be concerns for, you know, like credibility. I do want to note that just because somebody has a diagnosis of schizophrenia does not deem them totally incredible. This is why you do your full investigation. But don't just assume because you're taking a statement from somebody that has schizophrenia that everything they say is not based in reality, because there are some aspects that may be based in reality and some things that may be related to a delusion or hallucination, but that's why you need to do a full investigation. But that's a little side note for that. But a lot of the symptoms of schizophrenia can impair someone's ability to do their day-to-day living. It has such an impact on their relationships, and especially for support systems that don't understand schizophrenia, it's commonly misunderstood. And so that's why a lot of times they will, you know, if they are receiving mental health treatment, a big part of that treatment is having them understand what their symptoms are, working with their significant others in their life, people, friends, their social support, and making sure they understand what's happening too, so they can really assist. So I do want to acknowledge, so let's go, I do want to acknowledge the difficulties when you're talking with somebody that's experiencing these symptoms in an interview. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, actually, because we're going to talk more about psychosis, and I want to mention this here in a moment, but getting ahead of myself. So with psychosis, you know, this is a trademark. Most people associate schizophrenia, psychosis, but many don't realize that psychosis can happen in bipolar disorder. It's actually about, I think it's a little over half of the people will experience at least one psychotic episode during their, you know, during their time, or during their life. And these psychoses tend to present a little differently. Like psychosis and schizophrenia may look different than, you know, psychosis with other conditions. So like for a person with bipolar disorder, that will, when they're in a manic episode, it tends to be, they call it like mood congruent. So if somebody is feeling elevated and on top of the world, it kind of makes sense that they would maybe experiencing grandiose delusions. You know, they're feeling they are actually on top of the world. I am actually Superman. I can actually fly. And then, you know, we would certainly be concerned about that. We would want to intervene. So consider too, psychosis can happen with major depression. And this is something that not a lot of people know. It's actually, NAMI estimates about 20% of people with major depression will experience what they call psychotic depression. And so in these delusions, again, mood congruent, tend to be related to that guilt, that even paranoia, and a lot of times they're related to the body. So one example would be somebody believes they have a worm in their intestines and it's eating them from the inside. I'm so sorry, that's so graphic. I didn't give a warning, but imagine believing that and trying to live your life thinking about that this is happening to you. And a lot of times that is related to, but I deserve it. I don't deserve better. You know, that I have this worm in me because I did something bad or because I'm a bad person. So just so you know, just because somebody, if somebody is experiencing hallucinations and delusions, does not mean, oh, they have schizophrenia, because it can occur in other conditions too. So when you are working with somebody that is actively experiencing hallucinations, in particular auditory hallucinations, imagine how challenging a conversation must be on the other side. And I know there are trainings out there where, people will, like you have people talking in your ear while you're trying to talk to another person. And I've done this before, and it's challenging. And I can't imagine, like, I have a hard time even just having a conversation with the TV on. I can't imagine what that's like, happening, and I can't turn it off. I can't turn it down. And this person in front of me is talking to me. Yeah, they're gonna feel distracted. They're gonna feel disconnected, and you might get frustrated as the interviewer. They're not listening to me. They're not paying attention. But consider they may be experiencing auditory hallucinations. How to adapt for these things, again, allow plenty of time for that contact. You do not want to rush these conversations with somebody experiencing psychosis. Using that simple language, offering to go slow. Let's slow it down a little bit. I'm a fast talker. I'm trying to slow it down for this because I get excited talking about mental health. But talking at this speed may be a lot for somebody that's also processing auditory hallucinations. One thing I do want to mention, because a lot of times I get asked, well, what do I do to handle delusions and hallucinations? Like, if you are working with Josephine, do you say, I don't believe you. Garth Brooks is on tour on the other side of the world. There's no way he's coming to your house. What's that going to do for my rapport? What's that going to do with my interactions with her? It's going to shut her down. And she believes that this is her reality. And you telling her that this is not real is diminishing your credibility. So, but on the other side of things, you don't want to lean in and say, oh yeah, tell me all about it. Are you guys gonna get married? What's the plan? What's the, how are you feeling? Like, you don't want to lean into it either. You don't want to say, prove it to me, show me. What you do want to do is validate their experience and confirm, like, hey, look, I know that this is causing you a lot of distress. So the feelings that you're feeling are real. You don't, and leave it at that and focus on that. And then, yes, when I tell this story, in my head, I was like, oh, this is interesting. I don't tell it with the intent to, make you laugh or to make fun of it. It's just, these are things that you will encounter, and you need to be prepared to have a straight face when you're talking to them, even if it totally catches you off guard. Okay, so I'm going to try to move forward. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Because I do want to acknowledge that, so I know we're coming low on time, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions, but I do want to acknowledge that there is a time to ask for help. Just because somebody is experiencing psychosis does not automatically deem that to be an emergency. One of the biggest takeaways is one of the biggest indicators that is a situation is a crisis and emergency intervention is needed when a person is expressing suicidal thoughts of harming themselves or thoughts of harming others. That's when you treat it as a crisis, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't feel like you have to take all that on your own. We are APS workers. We're not superheroes. We're not expected to, work our cases at all costs necessary. So let's go ahead to the next slide. This is my final slide, but just reminding you again, each person is unique. Don't just focus on the problems when you're working with somebody. I always appreciate the a strength-based approach where you're not just focusing in on what's wrong. Let's look at what's going right. What are your supports? What is helping you? What helps you with your stress? And I just want to end it by saying, I appreciate you all being here, because talking about mental health is one of the best ways to destigmatize it, talking about it in a healthy way, normalizing it, and becoming more educated on it. And I do want to note that, as I mentioned early on, I work for the National APS Training Center, and we do offer free trainings, one of which does talk about mental health, and it does go into this in a bit more detail if you prefer to see it all in writing. And we do have a section that talks about suicidality, which is a whole topic that, everyone should be comfortable with. But yeah, so I'm going to put that link to that in the chat. But now I will offer this up for questions. So Sorry, I get so excited about this and I can talk probably for hours on it, but I will not. So,
Okay.
what do we got for questions?
Thank you, Katie, because we do have a couple of very positive comments, but I'm not going to get to those because I want to make sure we get to the question. Okay. So one of the questions is, how common is it for someone to develop schizophrenia or hallucinations, delusions after having a stroke? A client's family believes that caused it as she started having these behaviors after a stroke in her 60s.
Hmm. That is interesting. And I'll be completely honest, when we get into like medical conditions, activating things, I know what I can't, I'm a little less clear on that part, but what I can say is one thing they've noted with late onset schizophrenia, many of the researchers believe that it's coming from genetics, that people are often predisposed to it and it's just something that's setting it off. I'm not familiar on if a stroke can activate that or not. I'm not sure, but I would be happy to look into it because I'm very interested in this question as well. But I apologize, I don't have a firm answer on that.
Okay. Another one. Often I see the challenge for APS workers is getting the client into or back into good care and strong connections with their medical team, ensuring that they have all the support that can be provided to help them get into care and stay in care. I know there's no trick to this, but do you think there's a key thought or approach or remembrance that could help APS workers and programs to help with this?
Oh my goodness, I love this question. And this is where if I had a whole nother half hour, I would just totally go into like brainstorm session, but I will keep my answer short and concise. I will say the best results that I've achieved as an APS worker is one, having a better understanding of the mental health condition, because then that will provide you a better context to set reasonable expectations with not just your communication, but also your case planning. So also going in and being mindful of your own bias, because if somebody is going in, like if 18-year-old Katie, who was thinking all people with schizophrenia are violent and going to attack me, that's not going to be productive later on when I'm working with working APS cases, because people can sense that. They can sense that when you are bringing that stereotyping, that bias, because it tends to show up in your language, how you word things, how you say things, and just your general attitude towards them. And so being aware of those biases and educating yourself and genuinely listening and taking that time to build that rapport. Because the moment you label somebody as, oh, they got a mental health condition, I'm not going to waste my time on this too much because it's not going to go anywhere. Because I know mental health cases can be frustrating. I acknowledge that. I've been there. I know it. But you have to work beyond that to build those relationships. So I'll hop off my little soapbox now and just let that sit for that question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more, so I'm going
All
to
right.
ask this one. Are folks familiar with mental health first aid for older adults? And could you speak to the role of loneliness and social isolation? And you may not be able to get to that second part, but if you could address
Ooh.
the first part, that would be great.
Oh man, I love this question so much. So I will say I have experience with mental health first aid. I personally have not taken the class or am familiar with the class that's specific to that with older adults, but in just doing an initial search of it at some point in time, I was like, oh, this looks pretty cool. It looks interesting. So I can't really speak to that specifically, but mental health first aid is a very effective, very good way of getting more acclimated and comfortable with talking about mental health. They do a really good job with that. Loneliness and isolation, oh my goodness, that's a whole nother topic I would love to get into, but that's one of the biggest risk factors for developing a mental health condition later in life, is that loneliness and isolation. And so so building those support networks in your life and your clients' lives can really help buffer those conditions, can really help with those things. So yeah, I wish I had more time, but I hear you, and I love this question. So
We are out of time. Next slide, please. And so thank you everyone for your questions. You will see on the screen the contact information for the APS TARC. If you guys have any other questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us using one of these mini social media or our web-based links. Again, this webinar was recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel as soon as we get the captioning done. and we will make sure everybody who registered is made aware. I want to thank you again, Katie, for the presentation. It was very well received based on some of the comments that I'm reading right now. And
Wonderful.
I wish everybody a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.